Welcome to Real Life Fiction Stories, and thank you for joining me. What a night, huh? The light casting its shadows as it splits the dark. Looks almost like a nebula in the inky void of space, bidding me join it in the dark. Reminds me of a story I'm told is true. It happened to a friend of a friend and began on a night not unlike this one, and well, just so happens to have been in this area not too far away. A story about a man following his passion for the outdoors and his escape from the modern dregs of society. A man who finds himself lost in the one place he has always felt at home, and driven out by something that has claimed the wilderness for its own. Seth had been an outdoorsman all of his life. Ever since he could remember, his dad or one family relative or another had him running around some national forest or park, camping, hunting, fishing, or hell, all three when they had enough time in the right season. Even now at 50+ years old, he was still fairly confident enough to trek out into the wilderness alone, which he did, often, and greatly enjoyed it. There were times when he and his like-minded buddies would head out into the wilderness together, and those were great trips, but there was something about being alone. The wind in the trees, the babbling of the river, the soft squeaks and chirps of birds and animals in the brush, the only ones talking back to you as you mumble to yourself along the path. On this trip, his goal was to make it to Blue Jay Summit, a peak about 30 miles into state-designated wilderness. Seth liked to go old school. His hero Teddy Roosevelt never needed no stinking GPS or cell phone, so he didn't either. He looked along the trail and let his mind relax, letting the sounds of the rustling leaves fill his ears as he began his journey. At first, his thoughts played out old bits of songs that get stuck in your head, and funny lines from his favorite movies. But after an hour or so, he found his mind engulfed by his surroundings. Every twig snap or gravel crunch he could hear, almost feel. Occasionally, he would see a squirrel dart across the open path or hear something rustle in the bushes that would catch his attention. As long as it wasn't big, he was calm. This area was known to have both black bear and mountain lions, and his only protection was a 5-foot stick about 2 inches thick he had found at the start of the trail. In all of his years of wilderness exploration, he had never needed more. He'd encountered bear and mountain lion before, but they were always situations that he could back away from and retreat, or scare them away. Situations he could control, situations he felt safe in because he never took unnecessary risks, and knew much about the land and animals he spent so much time with. He had made it 10 miles that first day, right on schedule. The sun was just about to touch the rim of the valley, giving him about an hour or so to set up his camp with daylight. He was done with a roaring fire before darkness had swallowed up his surroundings, and had a cup of hot coffee warming his bones as he sat and stared into the complete black of the forest. The only border between him and the void was the perimeter created by a few trees softly glowing orange from his firelight. He reveled in the added layer of solitude the darkness provided. He gazed up at the moonless night sky, marveling at the river of diamonds above the world so few in the cities ever had the opportunity to see. A white streak suddenly flashed across the sky, and an explosion like a firework of fiery yellow burst out from the black what could have been no more than 2 or 3 miles away. Seth guessed the meteorite must have been no bigger than a laptop before it exploded, and doubted anything would be left, but it seemed like it was near the way he was headed, so he would keep an eye out for any meteorite debris just in case. He didn't quite know what to look for, but figured it would probably just look like a rock that didn't belong. He decided at any rate it was a good luck omen, telling he was on the right path and would have a great trip, whether or not he found anything. He climbed into his one-man tent and into his sleeping bag and fell asleep almost immediately. That morning, Seth awoke to the sounds of birds chirping and the morning sun in his eyes. He was quick to pack up camp, as he wanted to get an early start on the day. The fishing was pretty good further up the way, and if he wanted fresh dinner before the sunset, he would have to get a move on it. The morning had a strange haze to it that Seth had never seen before, and as he walked up the trail closer to where the meteorite had appeared to have exploded over, it seemed to get thicker, almost like there was a fire nearby, except there was no smell of smoke. He stopped for a moment, soaking in just how strange this was. He had just finished a long incline when the trail met flat forest once again, so he was also glad for the opportunity for a quick breather as well. He had been staring up at the mountain peak when he decided to move on, and as he pivoted around to continue up the trail, his foot landed on something small, smooth and round, causing him to slip and fall. As he did, he threw out his hands to brace for impact. The palms of his hands landed hard, and his right one landed on something like what he had slipped on, and it burst under his impact. The resulting shards had sliced open his palm. His hand was now wet with blood, and a strange liquid that was inside whatever he had landed on. Seth sat up and pulled the first aid kit out of his pack. When he was done tending to his injuries, he looked around for what had made him trip. He noticed a few of what looked like to be giant acorns with no cap about the size of a golf ball, tan with faded violet stripes scattered around the forest floor. They looked more at home in the ocean than they did up here. He picked up one of the shards his hand landed on, and a clear, translucent goo with green specks dripped off of it. He took a couple of small empty storage bags from his pack and placed the shard and some of the goo inside one, and an intact one next to a tree in the other, hoping someone could identify it when he got back. He decided to press on a little further, as he had hoped to at least get to the fishing area to catch something for dinner, and maybe breakfast the next day to help power him through the early return trip home. There would be no way he could finish the trip with his main hand cut open. Lucky for Seth, he made better time than he had planned, and even luckier still, even with a busted hand, he managed to land 4 trout late that afternoon on the shores of some tiny lake fed by local streams. He had eaten his fill, and as he lay back against his pack-turned backrest staring into the night, he tried to ignore the warm sensation in his right palm that felt like it was just begging to spread its way throughout his body. He decided sleep was the best thing for it, and so he turned in as the young moon rose over the tree line. The next morning, he awoke to a searing hot pain radiating up his right arm from the cut he had gotten the day before. It seemed despite his best first aid efforts, including a heavy application of alcohol and antibacterial ointment, his wound had become infected. His whole right arm was on fire, and the pounding in his head blurred his vision. Getting up was slow going. He thought of the leftover fish he had cooked and wrapped and stored the night before, but decided not to eat it. His stomach was not having it. It took him almost 2 hours longer than usual to pack up, and even though he didn't have breakfast, he was finally on the trail by mid-afternoon. He had hoped he would be able to make it a lot further than he actually did, considering it was all downhill, but he felt weak, and the gear on his back bumped his arm with every step, searing a reminder into his brain of just how infected his wound had become. His mind wheeled in fever, and the sounds and lights seemed to echo and stab inside of his head. Finally, he collapsed, his body refusing to push any further. He had only made it about a mile. As he lay sprawled on the ground staring up at the tree canopy waiting to black out, he heard the approach of people. He slowly and painfully turned his head to look, and saw 2 blurry figures cautiously making their way toward him. He was too weak to focus on their faces still, but as they approached he could see they were dressed in khakis, with wide-brimmed hats and badges on the front of their chests. Rangers. Thank God, he thought, relieved. When they were close enough for him to focus on, he saw they were a woman in her early 30s and a man in his mid-50s. He had expected them to ask if he was okay. Does he need help? Stay calm? Something. They only looked down at him. Help me, Seth choked out weakly. Still, they only stared down at him. After a moment, they turned their attention to his arm. The man crouched down and got close enough to the wound on his hand that Seth could feel his breath on it as he exhaled. But he never touched it. He again looked at Seth in the face. "How'd you cut yourself, pal?" he asked. "I fell on something," Seth managed. "What did you fall on?" The man's words hypnotic, his eyes fixed on Seth's. "In my back." Every word for Seth was a struggle, but he needed help. The man gently unzipped Seth's pack without having to take it off, and behind his clothes, an air mattress and first aid kit were 2 Ziploc bags, one with what looked like strange shards and a clearish goo with green specks, and the other held a giant psychedelic acorn. The man looked briefly at the 2 bags before handing them to the woman. Seth didn't know if he was delirious from the fever, or if they were speaking some language he never heard before, but suddenly, he couldn't understand them. The woman pulled off her backpack and put them inside, before pulling out what looked like a metal pen case and handing it to the man. He took it and removed the syringe that was hiding inside. "You have a bad infection. This is going to stop it, okay, pal?" Seth nodded, not really understanding or caring. The man took hold of his hand, causing Seth's skeleton to want to leap out of his body. It hurt so bad. "Easy, pal, easy," the man reassured. He slowly stuck the needle into the wound so deep, Seth was sure he'd hit bone. He stiffened and grit his teeth with a low grunt, but it was out before he could think a complete thought. His arm immediately felt cooler, and he thought he could actually feel the infection receding. "You're lucky we got to you in time, pal," the man said, standing up, putting the syringe away and handing it back to his partner. "Even if you made it long enough to get to the hospital, you wouldn't have lived long. Those strange pod-looking things you cut your hand on are seed cases, and I'm afraid the organisms inside would have had a field day with your immune system and any antibiotics you have here on Earth." Seth stared in complete confusion. He was still weak, and nothing he was hearing was making any sense. "I see you're confused. Let me explain, pal. You see, my partner and I come from far away. Light years, in fact. Years ago, our scientists shot satellites into space in an attempt to find an ecosystem similar to ours that would be able to support our more complex life forms. An organism that looks like a cross between a fern and vines, though more closely related to fungi on a biological level, was chosen. Back home, it can grow 50 feet high in the span of only a few hundred years, its tendril vines reaching down to the planet's surface, spreading in a blanket of deep purple and green accented in blossoms of gold, and fruit of deep scarlet. They're extremely resilient organisms, and if any complex life of ours could make it off-world, it would be them. Those satellite shuttles were aimed at a tiny blue speck in the distance, at a planet our scientists thought might be the best shot. This month, they finally began to reach Earth and rain down on its surface. There was one unforeseen hurdle, however. Back home, these organisms are created of chaos and calamity. Only extreme temperatures, such as from one of our firestorms back home, were able to cause them to germinate. Our scientists had believed the extreme heat and atmospheric entry would be enough to begin the process, however, the burn time wasn't long enough. That is where you got lucky. We're only here because of the impact the night before last. Our top minds have determined a fire in this region is both not uncommon and would provide hot enough temperatures and ample burn time for them to begin their life cycle. We're here to set the forest on fire." As if to emphasize his point, the man on the man's wrist Seth had mistaken for a wristwatch began to hum as the man splayed his fingers apart. A tiny fire manifested in between them and spiraled into a ball of flame in his palm. A second later, the humming ceased, and the flame evaporated into nothingness. "What are you going to do with me?" Seth began hesitantly. "Kill me?" he finished with a swallow. He didn't know if he believed the man's crazy story or not. Frankly, the fact he could summon a fireball like a goddamn wizard was cause for concern enough. Seth was now in the grips of a paralyzing anxiety he had never felt before. He had at one moment been on the brink of death, and suddenly healed and thrust into some science fiction story. "If we were going to kill you, pal, why take the time to heal your infection?" He smiled at Seth. "What then?" Seth asked, unconsciously rearing away from the man's grin. "Nothing," the man said flatly. "We'll let you get back to your car before we begin. You can go home and tell your friends and family whatever you want and live your life how you see fit. How you deal with this knowledge will give us great insight for future planning. It'll be interesting to see how you prepare for something you can't even imagine. Until then, we'll watch and wait, and when the time is right and if the environment is suitable, claim a new settlement for our people. Don't worry, that'll be hundreds of years from now and humans will be long gone. We'll make sure. This is just phase 1 after all." The forest fires made the news all that summer. They happened in numbers and in severity never before seen. In the end, Seth tells very few people of what had happened. He figures if they knew where he was that week, he might be implicated in the fires. No one he did tell believed him anyway. One thing he is adamant about, though, with anyone who is lucky enough to get him on the subject of biological discoveries. He says he won't be surprised if the number of newly discovered organisms in North American woods doesn't start to increase in the next couple of years.